Milu and Milu Minu Ilam Makswait. Welcome everybody. My name's Ted Cadwallader with my co-hosts today, Lawrence Mitchell and Stephanie Johnson, Somquatan and Squishfeld Kanat. We're pleased to welcome you all to our third season of Learning with Syeyutsus. Our Learning with Syeyutsus started a few years ago. It's the Nanaimo Ladysmith Public Schools work to learn how to be a better relative on the lands of the Hul'qumi'num speaking peoples, the Snanawas, the Snuneymuxw, and the Tsiminas. We, as always, will follow the protocols of this land, and we'll turn it to our friend Somquatan to open our house.
I met Squall New Wheatlam at Schwalaquat and Whale Hydka. And that's at eat Steetlam at Whale. I'm going to start off by sharing a prayer and a song, my friends. Perhaps eats CM Hydka. Hydk at a hael I squail at an aquail. Hydka at a hael I met tamach eat to muck stem at an aquail eat to muck squail. Hydka needs hali. Tepetimatama zichwam amastal squalwan. Ichwam quam stuch to squalwanst. At a thema size. Ichwam eats a watal. Tatal at the sheikh at an aquail to muck squail. Haichka quits what at an tamach at an aquail it muck squail. Nawash quams at a salits it's a CM Haichka.
It's my friend. It was like that, setting our space in the right way, inviting our ancestors and our relatives yet to be born to come and join around us and listen to our words today. I want to raise my hands in thanks to our partners, UBC Press. I don't know if Carrie Kilmartin's in our chat group somewhere, and the Vancouver Island Regional Libraries this year for holding some space in their buildings and with their clients to share some of our words today. Also, like when we start off, Lawrence, with gratitude, right? It's such an embedded way of being on this territory. Thankfulness, gratitude to start the day. We are very pleased to have join us today author, teacher, activist, good troublemaker, and professor, Dr. Carol Lynne D'Arcangelis. We so enjoyed reading her book, The Solidarity Encounter, Women, Activism, and Creating Non-Colonizing Relationships. I like that terminology as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. D'Arcangelis.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen to get started here. Okay. All right, so everyone can see what I see, I hope. All right, perfect. So that's the name of the book. And why, oops, hold on. I don't know why it's not. I'm going to share a different part of my screen because I think it's not, I think I shared the wrong thing. Sorry. Okay, so I have a few starting points before I get into the sort of key findings of the book. And the first thing I would like to do is acknowledge the territory that I'm on right now. Ukdamhumguk is the Mi'kmaq name for the island of Newfoundland. As you know, that's where Memorial University's campus is in St. John's. And so we are situated on the traditional territories of a number of Indigenous groups. And I hope you can sort of see here. Can you see my pointer as I'm talking? Yeah, okay. So this is the island of Newfoundland, and here is Labrador. So it gives you a sense of how big Labrador is. But the Innu, the Inuit, and of course the Beothuk, who are not with us essentially anymore, and the Mi'kmaq and Mi'kmaqi is pretty big too, the Wabanaki Confederacy. So I would also like to acknowledge the sort of, well, the territory that I come from, and also the territory where I was when I did the work. And so that was Take Toronto or Toronto. I think Toronto is around here. It's a little bit, no, sorry, here. See Mississauga. Here's it's a little bit hard to see what's water, but I think it's around there because there's Erie and Pennsylvania. And so the Mississauga of the New Credit and the Wendat peoples, are the peoples of that territory. But I also would like to mention, hold on, I'll go back here. I'm from upstate New York, right around here in Mohawk territory. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. And that in Mohawk, the word for Mohawk in Mohawk is Kanyigahaga. So the Kanyigahaga are an Iroquoian people, originally of the Mohawk River Valley, located between the present-day city of Albany and the town of Herkimer, New York. As a consequence of centuries of settler colonialism, they are scattered across 8 communities in the provinces of Ontario and Quebec in Canada, and in upstate New York in the United States. And so you might know the Six Nations Confederacy, and these are the folks that make up the Six Nations Confederacy, and they created one of the world's first constitutional democracies prior to European contact. And in 1722, 1722, the 5 nations became 6, adding Tuscarora. And so you might have heard of the Haudenosaunee or 6 Nations Confederacy. So, you know, I'm from that territory. So I want to dedicate the book, you know, and today's presentation to my mom, Carol Lynne D'Arcangelis, and also to Lee Miracle, the Stolo Métis author, scholar, poet, writer. As I mentioned to the folks before we started, Lee Miracle was very instrumental from the get-go and helping me to refine the project before I did interviews or anything like that. And of course, my mom, you know, taught me, oh, I'm going to get emotional here. My mom taught me, I think, very many lessons in how to be a good relative, to use your term that, you know, you were talking about that as well prior to starting this event. So I have a bunch of thanks to the participants, the 24 women that I interviewed, to the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council who funded the work, to the Nanaimo Ladysmith Public Schools, to UBC Press and all the folks there, to the Vancouver Island Regional Library, and to you, I said it right, didn't I? Ted Cadwallader, Lawrence Mitchell, and Stephanie Johnson for creating this space with me today, and of course, the audience, who I hope to not take up too much time talking, but if I do, I've already told Ted that he can interrupt me. So I want to say that, you know, I hope I got it right again. You know, it's just interesting. All of these are from nativeland.ca, I think, or nativeland.com. It's written there in the bottom. And so, you know, it's interesting that maybe not interesting, I think it's just that it doesn't give the place names that were imposed upon these areas, right? So can you, this is you folks, yeah? This island, is this right?
That's us, yeah.
Okay, so the reason why I wanted to show this is because, you know, this book was done on a particular territory in a particular context. And so some of what, you know, the insights that we came to might not be applicable. They might be applicable, but I really encourage people to think about their local context. And that's why I included this map. So I want to talk a little bit about my process, the key ideas, as well as issuing some caveats, which I think are important. One of the things I say in the book a few times, because I really wanted to maybe not mitigate, but temper what might be a very negative feeling that people might walk away with. And it's not, you know, it is a very critical book because I am talking about the problems, but that's not all there is. So that's why I'm going to issue some caveats to temper the rest of the discussion. So I want to start by reading something from the preface, sorry. And this is the emblem of No More Silence, the organization that I sort of got me where I am today. So I'll just start if that's okay. A brilliant sun streams through the room's tall windows. I am at an event hosted by First Nations House at the University of Toronto. It is the early 2000s. We are upwards of 15 people gathered in a circle, at ease yet riveted by the conversation. The speaker is mixed race Cree woman, scholar, activist, author, and artist Robin Bourgeois, and the topic, colonial constructions of Indigenous women as disposable. It is my introduction to the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people across what many now call Canada. Bourgeois' stark, impassioned critique provoked my anger and activist impulses, which are not incidentally among the white settler reactions to Indigenous struggles that I scrutinize in this book. Not long after, I became a non-Indigenous member of No More Silence, a group of Indigenous women and non-Indigenous women dedicated to raising awareness about the issue. Excuse me. I have stayed connected ever since. So in the intervening years, public awareness of the issue has increased exponentially thanks to decades of organizing by Indigenous warrior women, as Bourgeois calls them, so much so that the Trudeau government finally launched a public inquiry into the matter in 2015. At the time, however, the topic rarely made it onto the public radar and was certainly new to me. That talk at First Nations House became a defining moment of my next decade, ultimately propelling me to research what I call the solidarity encounter between Indigenous women and white women in a contemporary Canadian context. So immersed in the realm of Indigenous, non-Indigenous political solidarity, I soon became familiar with what was supposed to undergird our social justice imaginaries. So in the activist spaces I frequented, we were expected to valorize and act on an anti-colonial analysis of Canadian settler state institutions. I also internalized the oft-repeated refrain of Indigenous and non-Indigenous voices alike, that non-Indigenous allies should take direction from the Indigenous protagonists in our midst. I also frequently heard it said that establishing friendships with Indigenous peoples and communities is a prerequisite for political solidarity work. And I recall my increasing unease with this assumed truism, another element of my experience that shapes this research. I became well-versed in widespread Indigenous critiques of the savior mentality said to drive many non-Indigenous allies, especially white women. I therefore became hyper-vigilant about my position in the work as a quote-unquote white settler woman, which I define as a non-Indigenous woman of European descent whose whiteness goes without comment in most settings. All of this is to say, I could talk the talk. Nevertheless, something was niggling at me as I faced the apparent intractability of settler colonialism. How do everyday interactions between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people reproduce colonial power structures, especially when allies are supposed to know better? In other words, the connection between the micro and the macro continued to elude me. I could not figure out, let alone explain, how white women embody and enact colonialism in everyday spaces, activist spaces. On a personal level, I frankly did not grasp how my own seemingly individual good intentions might help shore up collective white privilege. And so I became curious about how white settler colonial power relations, whether reproduced or contested, play out in the solidarity encounter, and in particular, how white women within that encounter negotiate our structurally dominant position as settlers. So with these initial thoughts, I spoke with 13 Indigenous women and 11 white women about their experiences of solidarity work. So that preface says a lot, about why I started the book. So I want to talk a little bit now about process. So as I said, I interviewed these folks, and this was sort of one of the most, I think, not startling, but one of those aha moments which lasted for months, right? That through juxtaposing Indigenous women's representations of white women and white women's self-representations, in effect, I found myself interpreting Indigenous descriptions of the solidarity encounters challenges side by side with white women's self-ascribed reasons for engaging in the work. The bulk of my analysis involved unearthing what this juxtaposition reveals, a sometimes unacknowledged and often problematic aspect of what I call gendered colonial subjectivity in solidarity work. which is white women's desires for and pursuit of proximity to Indigenous others. So I'm going to break that down, but the reason why I include this is because it was really interesting to me that many of us, the white women, and this, I'm including myself in this boat, we would explain our motivations and our reasons for getting involved in the work, and really not seeing much, if anything, about that as problematic. And so I didn't see it as problematic until I started juxtaposing how Indigenous women were interpreting white women. Right? So anyway, in retrospect, it seems kind of obvious, but I'm telling you, it was a months-long aha moment. So here are the caveats that I want to issue. So I'm not talking about individuals, although I quote individuals, right? I cite individuals, especially in the first chapter where I talk about the spectrum of proximity. I'm really talking, I sort of share excerpts from these different narratives of the white women I focus on in that chapter. But my point is not to sort of make claims about any one individual. And this is really important because I'm talking about something collective, right? The rules of like what it means to be a settler in settler colonial Canada at this moment. They're kind of certain rules, right, that are there. That's what I refer to as collective subjectivity, like everything that goes into creating who we are, our attitudes, our behaviors, et cetera, messages from outside of ourselves. And so what I was looking for were the discursive patterns in these narratives. So instead, I consider what participants' expressed motivations for entering into solidarity work indicate about collective white settler woman subjectivity and the power relations at play. So, subjectivity, we could think of it also as what everything goes into personhood, right? That's another way I think that we could think about subjectivity as a concept. So caveat number 2, I really think I still run the risk of oversimplifying people's motivations and reasons. When I say people's, I'm talking about white women here. Their motivations, our motivations for entering into this work. And I also think there's a risk of over amplifying what I talk about, which is the desire for proximity. Yeah, and I'm just going to say that, you please keep that in mind if you do read the book. So here's what I say on page 34, and this is part of the introduction. I identified at least 3 other discourses related to women's motivations for entering into solidarity. And when I say women's, I'm talking about all women in here, not just white women. Responsibility and accountability, a shared political analysis and social justice inclinations, and practical or strategic motivations. To discuss proximity as a pattern across white participant narratives, I artificially disentangled our complex investments and motivations for engaging in solidarity work. So my analysis of the solidarity impulse, which I will define in a second, focuses on the proximity-related dimensions of white women's involvement in solidarity. So I really am sort of honing in on the problems in the hope that we can, stay here, right? Focus on the other quote unquote good motivations, responsibility, accountability, all of that sort of stuff. Caveat 3. So this is really getting at what I think might be a normative understanding of allyship, not just for me, but for other folks, and you can be the judge of that. And I call this sort of unidirectional solidarity. Just trying to find out where I am here in my notes. Yeah, so there is something an excerpt that I would like to read here to talk about this issue of unidirectional solidarity. And in particular, this third caveat. In this passage, I share a kind of, a vignette, something that happened in the course of doing the research, which had a great impact on me and made me aware of this potential issue. So I was operating with the common understanding of ally as, and this is a quote, a member of an oppressed group who works to end a form of oppression which gives her or him privilege. End of quote. That sounds reasonable, right? However, I began to wonder about the unforeseen limitations or flaws in this definition. Might it prop up a patronizing one-way flow of solidarity as something bestowed to the quote-unquote less privileged, thereby sustaining the very hierarchical relations it means to challenge? Does it preclude people outside of dominant groups, including Indigenous women, from being allies in struggle? And this comes from Sullivan Clark. An exchange midway through one of my early interviews with an Indigenous participant sparked these concerns. So when asked to define ally, she inquired back, as a white person or as a Native person? Her response left me temporarily flabbergasted and finally, frankly, panicked. Had I been conceptualizing allyship in unidirectional terms the whole time? The subsequent reaction of another Indigenous participant struck me equally forcibly. Allyship was again the theme. I casually commented, kind of interesting that we don't have a word to contrast with ally. She hesitated and said, that's because allies, I thought, are equal. So there shouldn't be anything to contrast with ally. And then she's started to say something like, only if you see solidarity work as charity, she clarified, would there be a contrasting concept? And here's another quote from her. The poor person, the injured, the grievance seeker, the person who has been aggrieved, the wounded, the victim, the helper versus the victim in the most classic patronizing way of doing solidarity. My self-doubt intensified. Had I already assigned white women the role of helper and Indigenous women the role of beneficiary? Jolted into awareness of one of my deeply held orientations towards solidarity work, I modified my methods. From then on, I asked two questions, one about the role of Indigenous women as allies and another about the role of white women as allies. To disrupt presumptions about a one-sided flow of solidarity from white women ally as subject to Indigenous woman as object. And, I make it sound easy, but this was also, I don't know how many months, but when I say flabbergasted and panicked, I mean it. Okay, so, but this is why we do this work, right? So why non-colonizing, you might ask? I have an answer for that. Actually somebody asked me that while I was doing this, and at that point I didn't have an answer, so I had to think about it. And again, I have to credit Lee Miracle because she said, in the original proposal, I had non-colonizing, decolonizing, uncolonizing, all kinds of colonizing, or prefaces. And she said, come on, choose. What's it going to be? All right. So I chose non-colonizing, and I did so because honestly, I thought it was a less presumptuous choice. Right? So you might sort of think of it as a kind of Hippocratic oath. This is the analogy that I came up with. And this is how I distill it on page 4 of the book. I have now come to think of non-colonizing as a precursor to decolonizing. It is the attitudes and actions that set the stage for a radical undoing of settler colonial structures. For a more robust or precise meaning of non-colonizing, that, dear reader, or listener in this case, is the subject of this book. So that's a little teaser there. So, and please, you know what, I didn't say this, but feel free to hop in with some questions. if you have them while I'm talking. Okay, I'm serious. It's fine.
That's good. No, we reached out in the chat to everybody too, and if they have any things they can jump
okay.
into. I really like
Yeah.
the discussion around non-colonizing, right? Because we talk about indigenizing, and we see that a lot, and we talk about decolonizing, but they all have well, there's no definition in there too, and some of the work that's framed as decolonizing or indigenizing comes across as really superficial and bureaucratic in nature. So I liked when you talked about non-colonizing, because it forces, I think, the reader, in this case the listener too, to think, well, what really does that mean when I go into a relationship? And Stephanie and Lawrence and I have talked about a third way of being. Right. And this references, in my mind, that third way of being. But I have to give up a whole bunch of ways that I've been taught how to think about how to be in that relationship. So I like that. And the book does a nice job of it too.
Okay, thank you, Ted. So now I'm going to jump into the key findings, which can be described as this. And of course, I feel like it takes a lot to break this down, because I'm throwing all these, for lack of a better word, jargony words your way. And hopefully I'll break it down. So the key finding is that a white desire for proximity can operate as a colonial impulse. So to talk about that, I coined different terms like the spectrum of proximity, the impulse to solidarity. And in all of this, I'm really talking about settler self-making, right? So what we might think of as sort of self-serving behavior, it's self-serving in the very literal sense of self, right? We become who we are, and we keep intact a sense of ourselves through what we do. So some of what we do is in the interest of maintaining that self. So that's what I'm talking about, right? So everybody engages in self-making, and we're not alone when we do that. We do it in context, right? So I have, again, I just spent so much time on this text. I feel like I say it better here than I could now. So that's why I'm going back to, again, the introduction, to explain what I mean. And here's a little picture you can look at as I'm talking, because the sort of underneath all of this, before you can understand what I mean by proximity, you have to know what sort of an underlying theoretical assumption or starting point is, which is this, that there is a white settler desire for belonging. So this quote talks a little bit, or this passage talks a little bit about that underlying premise, and then goes on to define these other terms that I mentioned. Okay, so and back to desire for belonging. In other words, part of being a settler involves a more often than not subconscious yearning to live legitimately on stolen land. What I find most remarkable about this desire is its manifestation in the solidarity encounter as a white desire to be close to Indigenous women. So there's the desire for proximity. It's there for a reason, right? It works. It helps us to become, ourselves, as it were. Ourselves according to what it means to be a settler, right? In this context. So this is what I call the quote unquote desire for proximity. Accordingly, much of what I track in this book falls under the problem with proximity. So by this, I mean the fact that over pursuing closeness through a multiplicity of ways and for a multiplicity of reasons, I'll get to those in a second, can potentially enable white women such as myself to disavow our complicity in colonial hierarchies. And that's how we gain a sense of belonging as individuals, and we kind of forget that we're actually part of a collective, right? The white settler collective. So working in tandem with the desire for proximity is the closely related white pursuit of exceptionalism, or the wish to be, or more cynically, to be seen as an exception to the rule, a good settler versus a bad settler, quote unquote. So to describe the desire for proximity in both its latent and manifest forms, I coined two phrases, the spectrum of proximity and the impulse to proximity. So the spectrum of proximity provides a way to group together desires that I find connote, involve, or require proximity in one form or another. And so I came up with this visual to try and demonstrate or visualize, show you in a visual way, the different desires for proximity, or what I'm grouping under this spectrum of proximity that are in the interests of self-making. And so I argue that this impulse, I'll just continue reading here. The impulse to solidarity refers to the latent or activated drive to satiate all these desires, which I'll show you in a second, through solidarity work. So that's the impulse to solidarity, right? This impulse to do this work because it can help us, in establishing ourselves. So I argue that this impulse, which is in effect an impulse to pursue proximity through solidarity work, flows from a particular formulation of what I call gendered colonial subjectivity. And there's a long sort of part of the book where I explain the historical sort of creation of that, like the helper, the good settler woman helper, but I'm going to skip all over that and talk about what's in the spectrum of proximity. So overall, there's a sort of infused throughout this is a quest for belonging, shall we say. But there are also explicit, and I'm saying there are in the narratives that I talk about, right, that I share in the book. There are sort of explicit desires for acceptance, inclusion, being welcomed, and sometimes forgiven by an Indigenous community, an Indigenous person. And it goes from the most frequent to the least, right, in terms of the answers to the various questions that I pose to people. The second one is a desire for healing or to be taken care of. The next one would be a desire to be empowered, to have self-worth, to have purpose. An example of that might be when a non-Indigenous woman might talk about how Indigenous women were and are still honored as women in their communities, and women are not honored in non-Indigenous communities. And so, I want to be a part of that where women are honored. This is what many of us are familiar with. It didn't come up that much. And this could, this is an attraction to or appreciation of Indigenous culture, tradition, and I can't see what the last word is because I'm blocked.
Oh, spirituality.
Thank you, spirituality. Yeah. And one of the chapters is actually dedicated to this, not because it came up so frequently, but because it's a hot topic now with the pretendingism and all that stuff. But what I argue is there's sort of a continuum there. It's not bad in and of itself to appreciate Indigenous culture or even be attracted to it, but it's that slippery slope to appropriation that is the problem, right? And I go into more detail. And finally, this idea that you want to learn and be challenged. So I think I sort of got into this a little bit when I said, there's in the caveat section, but I want to, I want to repeat this, right? The desire for proximity is not the only thing that motivates white women to do solidarity work with Indigenous women, right? I'm artificially sort of, taking this out and highlighting it. In fact, I want to flag the distinction between settler desires for legitimacy or belonging, which are precarious by definition in settler colonial contexts, and what I think of as the righteous desire to engage ethically with Indigenous peoples. And I think those desires are sort of mixed up and conflated. And so part of the work is to recognize, oh yeah, you know, I've got both of those things going on, right? And I want to stop the impulse to solidarity if it involves this desire for proximity. So how am I doing okay for time?
We've got about 15 minutes, 20 minutes left in that range.
Okay. So I'm not gonna. All right. So I'm going to, let's see here, not read what I was gonna read, but you can. I tried to be clever here, telling autobiographical moments or telling about autobiographical moments, because I share, you know, one of those aha moments where I realized that, you know, I too had this desire to be close to Indigenous folks, including in my work with No More Silence, because for a while we sort of became ostensibly a white group. And so people were saying, well, wait a minute, should we organize the February 14th strawberry ceremony? And we asked all these folks and stuff. And, you know, some people didn't want to do it anymore. And at that point in time, you know, I realized that I thought there was something missing if Indigenous women weren't there, right? Because we got the message that, yeah, sure, do the work, but do it as white women. If nobody else is organizing something, organize it. And then, you know, ultimately we created a coalition to organize that. But anyway, I have to skip over that. I'm also going to skip over this, which is another sort of vignette where well, actually, no, this is short, so maybe I can read this. So dusk had settled, and empty chairs dotted the mostly vacated room of the Native Women's Resource Center in Toronto, tasked to clean up after a documentary film screening about violence against Indigenous women. I unintentionally eavesdropped on a conversation between two Indigenous women organizers of the event and a white woman I had once met in passing. "Thank you for making me feel welcomed," the white woman said as she left. After some mutual eye rolling, I talked with the Indigenous women about what had just happened. Although I might have been confused, they were not. They made it clear that she was another white woman who wanted to feel welcome in what she saw as an Indigenous space. For these Indigenous women, this exchange was not an isolated incident, but typical of the kinds of solidarity encounters they have with some white women. I felt a swooning sense of self-righteousness, what I later heeded as a sign of my own desire to be exceptional, or to be seen as a good settler who knows better than to make such statements. So that's the vignette that opens up chapter 1. And let's see here. So I think I've kind of said this, but maybe I should make it clearer. The problem is not the desire for proximity. The problem is the pursuit of it, right? And the transgression of boundaries that should not be crossed. So this is how I put it in one part of the book. It's the unbridled, unthinking pursuit of proximity that can result in invasion, which is essentially colonialism. When white settler women attempt to get too close to Indigenous women, we can cross boundaries or thresholds, figurative or literal, that we should not cross. In these instances, solidarity risks being worse than ineffectual. It can reproduce white settler structural privilege. Okay, and maybe I should give some examples if you need them, more examples in the actual discussion. Okay, so again, I think I mentioned that these problems became clear to me once I juxtaposed these two sets of narratives, and this is where this sort of needy do-gooder term became apparent. And this is sort of the quintessential problematic figure. It's, and the Indigenous women described it as, there's always somebody like this. Most people are not, but there's always somebody, right? And so I think it's kind of self-apparent, but this is very short too. I think Danielle, one of the folks I talked to, sorry, what page is
On
having
89?
trouble? 89, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, so with infectious energy, no, sorry, I'll start later on. Shifting the focus to solidarity encounters, Danielle added, I guess the other piece is that there's some pretty needy individuals who are mixed up in the social justice movement, who need attention, who need to identify, who need all of these things. Danielle's point distilled is this. This is a quote again. They need to have a cause. They need to do good. They need the attention. They need the power. They need the control. Once I accustomed myself to Danielle's upfront manner, I processed her description of the average needy do-gooder as usually, but not exclusively, a white woman who exudes arrogance. Right? Sorry, it's kind of fun to come up with pictures. Gabriella, what page do I have on there? 91. These are all very short. So she says she's trying to explain the problem, right, Gabriella? And she says, she's talking about one person in particular, and she's trying to convey the gravity of the situation by motioning stop with her arm outstretched. And she says, I'm not explaining it very well, but there's a lot of tension around how to address bad behavior. And there are people who are not Indigenous, who I experience, and other people too, I know, who are really needy and want to engage with you in a way that you want to really move away rather than move toward. Well, kind of like a succubus. The ones who are kind of a succubus, yes, a succubus. You know what a succubus is. It sucks the blood. Yeah, the blood out. So while admitting that other people besides white people can be really needy, Gabriella experienced white needy do-gooder behavior on a whole other level, as predatory, akin to interacting with a succubus, interpreted here in vampiric, not seductive terms. So in this way, Gabriella vividly imagined a central feature of this behavior as described by Indigenous participants. A desire for and pursuit of proximity that morphs into evasiveness, whether metaphoric or embodied. Okay. Okay. So I want to end with Lee Miracle and Tanya Tagaq because it's
Yes.
they're
No
pretty,
explanation needed. No.
Yeah. Exactly. Sorry, I just got to figure out the page that I'm on. 77, 78. See, that's why I put it there to make this smooth. All right, so here are two quotes that I opened chapter 2 with. And chapter 2 is where I hone in on Indigenous women's narratives to sort of give them the last word, as after I talk about the spectrum of proximity. And I kind of, in chapter 1, which I mimicked the way that I came to understand things. Anyway, so this is the start. These are two quotes that I start the chapter with. This is Tanya Tagaq. I have a formal request that white women don't touch me or cry on me after shows. It drains my energy to comfort you. Keep the feeling in your heart and go home and research and ruminate and do something constructive with it. Now here's a quote from The Miracle. And I asked her if she could sort of define what colonizing behavior was. And this is part of what she said. There's a space between us that's the cherished thing. In my language, this is the home of the breath that we share. Both our breath is here, our common breath. The sound we make here is going to go around the world. It'll take 100 years. It'll come right back to this spot. That's sacred. This is what we cherish. So when you come too close and take up this space, then the cherished thing is gone. So I am going to end there. And I do apologize. I wanted to leave less time. There's a whole part of, actually, no, sorry. I should just go through this. This will be a minute.
Okay.
Towards the non-colonizing solidarity stuff, especially for white settlers. So if you understand the problem, like all of this is kind of straightforward. That's why I only spend one chapter on it. No, it's really because I ran out of space explaining the problem. So this is chapter 5. Step back, but not out. And I'm quoting one of the Indigenous participants. Recognize our structural location as settlers. And this is really keeping an anti-colonial framework and not acting like what an Indigenous feminist called Eileen Morton Robinson calls acting like an autonomous, independent individual. So, you know, you got to understand that what these seemingly individual desires are really collective desires. It's kind of a fallout of occupying this subject position of white settler. Privilege the collective political purpose of the work instead of, you know, strictly the personal or self-interested motivations. Grapple with your complicity without capitulating to guilt or shame, because that might lead us to that pursuit of proximity. Become emotionally involved versus emotional, right? Focus on power differences, not cultural differences. Engage in radical reflexivity. So yeah, look at yourself, but sort of do a double take and look back out at the structures. Finally, do not take ourselves so seriously. So that is the end of my presentation. Thank you for your patience in getting through that.
Oh, Carol Lynne, that was marvelous, because I know that the complexity of the work that was going on there. And anytime you work with human beings, it gets complex right away. It doesn't matter how old they are or what's going on. One of the things that you started with around advice was the local context and that power of place and understanding that place, right? Because as you say, your work you did this in Toronto. And so that has a specific place and cultural protocols and the things going on there. And they may be the same or different from where other people are at. So I like that piece of advice too, is know that territory, understand the context of that place.
Yeah, yeah.
You also talked a little bit about what our previous guest, Adam Barker, talked about was get in there, fail.
Yes.
Be embarrassed, feel clumsy,
right.
But don't leave. Learn and then try again, because we asked our children to do that. Fail, try again. Sure,
exactly.
And it doesn't feel great when you fail.
I just want to give I want to give a shout out to Adam Barker, because he's responsible for some of that fancy theory that I shared.
Yeah, and I'm not going to let Adam get away solo either, because Emma Battelle-Lowen has walked beside him for the whole trip and done her own work too.
Yes, and I quote them both. My bad.
It was and one of the questions that I have for you, though, is because you have some advice there at the end about non-colonizing relationships. We're an organization, Vancouver Island Regional Libraries, UBC Press, Nanaimo Lady Smith Public Schools, trying to do this work, trying to work in solidarity and understanding how to, I guess you use the term reversing the gaze, to look back at ourselves and go, okay, how are we doing this in a colonizing fashion? Are we just trying to carry all of that work into this space? So do you have some advice for people or organizations who are on this path, but particularly organizations, and not gender specific, but does that advice still stand?
I think so. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You know, and when I use the term reversing the gaze in the book to kind of describe my methodology, right? Because so much of academia has been the non-Indigenous anthropologist, you know, to cite the usual example, studying the other. And so the idea is that, you know, you reverse the gaze and you look at settler colonial structures and settler colonial subjectivity, not so much your individual self, but those structures, right? And that's important, because you don't want to get stuck on yourself. That's part of the problem, getting stuck in the self. So, you know, yes, think about yourself, you in particular, the collective that you're part of, and then sort of deflect, or like I don't know, it's not a boomerang, go a double take. And I use Sarah Ahmed's work for this, back onto the structures. So keeping in mind always that you're part of this structure. And I think if you do that, it does definitely kind of help you deal with this complicity, Because in a sense, I mean, it's not your fault. It's not helpful to think of it that way. It's you being involved in, you being born into an unequal system.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm repeating what I said
No,
or answering your
no.
question, but I just
Yeah.
think that bit about the collective is super, super important.
Yeah.
And it sort of helps you not take yourself so seriously. Go, of course I have these desires. Of course, that's what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to feel like I belong here, and I got to do some like nasty tricks to, to actually feel that way.
Yeah.
And once you start learning about the real history, that can lead to an identity crisis.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which
I think that's part of this next question from Melissa, who asked us in the chat. She says, I think this research is needed to pass on to the younger generation. What is one idea you think younger white women need to hear?
Okay, so besides all the other stuff that I said.
Well, maybe the same as older white women too. I don't know.
Yeah. Okay, this is something I haven't said. It's hard to choose one thing, but
these are my favorite.
Yeah, this gives me a chance to add.
Okay.
When you look at something as bi-directional, not unidirectional, not me imposing, like me offering my help, right? You also have to be critical of the people you're working with. Now, when I say critical, sort of subject them to critique, right? Yeah, when I saw that, right? It was kind of real, you know what I mean, real history.
Yeah.
But anyway, so you have to subject the folks to critique, and and work with people whose politics you share, right? Like if you want to end fracking, you're going to work with Indigenous people. You're not Indigenous, you're going to work with Indigenous people who want to end fracking, and Indigenous peoples are not a homogeneous category. So maybe that's what I would say, like you have to be true to your own politics here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Carolyn. I'm going to, as we pick at the end, I'm going to turn it over so some cotton can close our house for us. But I want to just say thank you very much for sharing these. I really encourage people to dig into that. There's lots of advice in there about how to be in that space without bringing all of that that unbiased or that biased nature of our colonial worlds to it. So
thank you so much. This was really great. Fantastic.
Syeyutsus, Syeyutama, the Tanaquail, CM Carol, Leichka, Schlachaket, Van Heil, CM Schwallowen, Neath, Whilts, Ast, Al, Tolno, Tashechts, Uqualis. I'm just really thanking you, my dearly respected relative, for laying down your good work and your most respectable feelings in everything that you do. And it's teaching us and helping us understand how to walk into tomorrow with a better awareness and unpacking of things that we're always questioning ourselves with. And it's helped a lot. And I really need to pick up this book and get a better awareness of how I can apply your thoughts into my life so I can help other people that I'm around every day. So the Sleekness, see it, the UBC Press, Vancouver Island Regional Libraries, School District 68 Heights at Amakshwet, at Tantima, Sias Titzel Namet, at Tana, Quail, Itumak Squail Heights app.
Thanks for joining us, everyone.
I just wanted to say thank you also for the reading recommendations. I was jotting them down.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day wherever you are.
Thanks, everyone.